Okay, we should be recording now. Welcome everyone to whatever number of Gospel Scholar Zoom conferences is, like five or something. Today I'm joined with Daniel Sorensen. He's going to be giving his presentation and Q&A on logical fallacies and anti-tactics. This is a super important area of discussion that I think everyone, members, missionaries alike, need to know about, to be aware of, and to able to address and point out explicitly for reasons that he'll talk about. So, Daniel, you should have the sharing permissions and you're good to go start whenever. So,
Awesome, sweet. So, just before I start, I'll just quickly introduce myself for those watching, specifically probably the missionaries, those watching and true missionaries. So, my name is Daniel Sorensen. I'm the host of a podcast called Sword and Spirit, where we respond to to critics by interviewing scholars, or we also do comeback stories, people coming back to faith. So, we've had people like Scott Woodward that's coming on. We've had people like Blake Ostler, a philosopher. We've had Brian Hales and just a lot of other scholars and historians, philosophers. So go check us out there. But for today, yeah, we're going to be talking a bit about logical fallacies and tactics because this is very, very important. And I'm going to go ahead and jump right in. I'm going to share my screen, hopefully. And if anyone of you guys have questions, feel free to just drop it in the chat, and I'm sure David could um, give those when we're at our Q&A section. But so we're gonna just go ahead and just get started. So, what are logical fallacies and what are tactics used by critics? Well, logical fallacies is an informal, we call it an informal fallacy, where basically it is where you or a person that is engaging in this fallacy is you're making a certain argument and you're appealing to this certain idea, this certain fallacy for your argument. And oftentimes these fallacies, it doesn't necessarily mean your argument is incorrect, but it does tend to weaken your argument. And this also separates you from good, bad faith actors. So why is this important? Why is understanding logical fallacies and tactics so important? Well, oftentimes, if you're engaging in apologetics, oftentimes it's unintentionally losing a battle. Oftentimes you'll go to someone and they'll say, well, here are all my laundry list issues with the church or my issues, a lot of these questions I have. And oftentimes it's a losing battle because you're put on the defensive, and as a result, you're not able to answer all these questions. So, and that's what we're going to discuss today. So, why it's important is oftentimes it's unintentionally falling into a losing battle. There is no winner when oftentimes when these happen. Second, understanding logical fallacies helps you make better arguments, which I'll dive into later. I'll expand on that in a little bit, but that's our second point. Third, recognizing these tactics allows you to recognize the good versus the bad faith actors. When I mean someone's acting in good or bad faith is missionaries. Oftentimes, you guys will hear people that are sincerely seeking truth and people that are just there to waste your time. Bad faith actors are not. Oh, excuse me. Bad faith actors are not there to come unto Christ. They are there to distract your time, and they're not worth time. Even after your mission, if you're engaging in apologetics, don't waste your time with bad faith actors because these individuals, they aren't really interested, and they're typically oftentimes the one that really engage in these fallacies. And then the third point, oh, sorry, fourth point. So this is what we're talking about is going to be necessary if you're going to engage in any form of intellectual discourse, because oftentimes even people that are professionals, experts, scholars, historians, philosophers, psychologists, whatever it is, even within this level of discourse, there's going to be some level of logical fallacy because there's just so many of them, and you can't completely get away from them. But it's going to be important to understand these things because it's going to allow you to be better, like I said, make better arguments, and just to bolster up your arguments and your claims and understand people too. because, like I said, just because someone engages in a logical fallacy doesn't mean they're wrong or their conclusion's wrong, but it does weaken their arguments. So these are the four things I want us to understand why this is so important. So I'm going to go into a list of logical fallacies and tactics where we're just going to, there's a number of them. This isn't all of them, but we have a number of them that I feel like were the most important to understand. So the first is presentism. So presentism relates to the psychological tendency to prioritize current perspectives, emotions, and cultural norms when assessing past experiences or predicting future ones. It is an inerrant human bias where our immediate context dominates our perception of time and history. In other words, judging the past based on today's standards. So, for example, you may see it as this image up here shows. Some may say, well, interracial marriages were an abomination. A true prophet would say such a thing. Okay, you're judging his context or his culture based on the context that we have today. That they may not necessarily have understood this at the time. For example, if people think this is just isolated to people like Joseph Smith and Brigham Young, go look of what Abraham Lincoln said about interracial marriage at the after he gave the Gettysburg Address, not before, but after. So we need to understand that things like this, like presentism, that we don't just justify whatever happened in the past, but we can at least acknowledge that they didn't have the mindset that we have now, maybe even the moral standing that we had now. So that's what presentism is, and to be aware of it. Next, a gish gallop. So you see on the right, you see accusations of an LDS critic against the Mormon Church, and they go from founder fraud. Joseph was a deceptive character who practiced treasure seeking, magic, made up the Book of Mormon, unscriptural doctrines, constant doctrinal changes, lack of transparency, hoarding wealth, political influence, harmful culture, LGBTQ discrimination, protection of abusers, racist history, high demand cult, shame based salvation. So this is what oftentimes a Gish Gallop is. It's a list of a number of accusations that it's designed to put the being that the person that is hearing all these accusations into a feeling of psychological tension where or even psychological turmoil. A prime example of this is a CS letter. As the definition says, it's overwhelming a person with as many arguments as possible without regard for accuracy or assurance. This is especially disingenuous when the person is not allowed to interrupt and address the arguments. For those of you guys that are missionaries watching, this is a very common one that I see a lot of return missionaries and missionaries fall into, because oftentimes you want to answer the person's questions, but when they give you this laundry list, whether it's to be a bad faith actor or not, when this happens, oftentimes you are overloaded with information, and it's designed to trip you up. So this is a very important one to be aware of because, like I said, I see countless missionaries fall prey to this specific fallacy. So this is what, as I said, this is what a Gish Gallop is. So, and like I said, a prime example of this is a CES letter. If you were here for a conversation we had a few months ago with when we did a Gospel Scholars mixed with the Calvary, this was an example of what Sarah Allen did when she gave a list of laundry accusations. So just being aware of this is very helpful. So next, ad hominem. All you probably heard of an ad hominem before, but a good example is this member of the church may say, "You're just bitter and offended. That's why you don't believe." This is an ad hominem on both sides. I want to be very, 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 very clear. It is not just members and that engage ad hominem, and it's not just ex-members. Oftentimes we'll say, "Oh, you're an ex-member," and oftentimes they do engage in ad hominem, but members are just as guilty of that. You've probably heard someone say, "You sinned. You just wanted to sin," and that maybe that became a thing later on, but oftentimes that is not the reason why people leave the church. So being aware is important. As it says, someone using this circumstantial ad hominem argument does not verbally abuse the opponent, but dismisses his or her arguments by suggesting that the opponent's circumstances are the sole reason why he or she embraces the conclusion. In other words, this argument is a way of ignoring the opponent's arguments and refusing to evaluate them on their own terms. So next, half truth. Yeah, my screen is glitching a little bit, but so you see a photo over here of John online. John, you and I can chat. Uh, half truth is it's adding facts to true. For a prime example, this is Joseph Smith married a 14-year-old. Warren Jeffs, who is the FLDS leader or prophet, Warren Jeffs married a 14-year-old. As a result, both were sexual groomers. That's what specifically what Warren Jeffs was charged with. One of the reasons why he's in was his sexual abuse and assault of minors. And basically, this half truth is saying, well, Joseph Smith married a 14-year-old. They because that's not what the historical record shows. So half truth is designed to be there. It's designed to put put forth this idea of, well, this is true, and why would you believe such a thing if this is true? And again, it's designed to really put you on the defensive and really acknowledging it's conceding the point. So acknowledging this is a half truth that needs more context is very important. Next, a false dichotomy. So a false dichotomy, it's misrepresenting a situation possibilities exist. This black and white thinking is used to manipulate or oversimplify complex alternatives. And just like critics will use is this example. This is my friend Timber Harward, who he is a Latter-day Saint in a mixed orientation marriage. So he is gay and and he's married to a woman. And one of the things that he has constantly heard is he said, stay, you can either stay in the church and be unhappy and depressed and probably even kill yourself, or leave and be authentic and happy. This is presenting just two alternatives, and that's oftentimes not the case. On the flip side, members specifically have done this false dichotomy in a variety of different ways too. Just like again, oh, you just wanted to sin. If you were a believing member of the church, you would be a lot more happy or joyful. Or someone that's saying you cannot be happy outside of the church. You have to be happy. You can only be happy inside of the church. This is an example of what we call a false dichotomy, which is very important. Very important to understand because a lot of people will make these certain claims. Next, guilt by association. I'm going to read this quote real quick. This is a quote by Kerry Muhlestein, where he says, I start with an assumption that the Book of Abraham and the Book of Mormon and anything else we get from the restored gospel is true. Any evidence I find, I will try and fit into that paradigm. So this is actually this quote is grabbed from a critic with the website called Mist and Sunday School, and specifically saying, well, he's just on the church's payroll, so he's really not a true scholar, is in essence kind of what they're saying. And a guilt by association fallacy is where it is discrediting someone's ideas or character simply because they are associated with a negatively viewed person, group, or belief. It falsely assumes that sharing one trait or connection means sharing all negative qualities of that group. Example, BYU scholars are paid by the church. They aren't real scholars because their research must agree with Mormonism. A prime example of this would be Stephen Smoot or like I said, Kerry Muhlestein with the Book of Abraham, where they're also Egyptologists, but people say, well, they're not real Egyptologists because they will only accept answers that align with the church. And because they're paid by the church, they won't do something under the church. And this is disregarding that they've been published on numerous journals or by numerous experts that are not LDS. So it's important to understand that just because someone is a member of a group, whether they're a critic, whether they're a believer, does not make them, just because of their bias, does not make them unqualified to talk about the certain issue. They all have a bias, and it's important that they recognize that because we all have biases. For more information on that, I would also go see Shaken Face Syndrome by Mike Ash, where he talks specifically about how everyone has a bias. You can't truly be objective. So next, a strawman fallacy. This little AI photo that I created, but it says, Mormons don't believe in God because they believe in the Bible is inerrant. Whoa, whoa, whoa. This is what Latter-day Saints believe at all. This is putting words basically into his mouth. So that's what strawman is. It occurs when someone attacks a weak version of an opponent's position or attacks a conclusion that the opponent does not support. For example, like it said, Mormons don't believe in God because they believe the Bible isn't inerrant. Well, that's not what Latter-day Saints. That's not what Latter-day Saints say. I don't think you could find a single Latter-day Saint that says that. But this is an example of putting words in someone's mouth. But again, it's not just evangelicals or critics, atheists, or whoever it is that's making this argument make it too. For example, we got three examples. First is Christians believe things without any evidence or reasoning. That's not the case, and the strawman of Christian beliefs. Another example, LDS members think the Bible is useless and was replaced by the Book of Mormon. We as Latter-day Saints do not agree with that. Our theology doesn't agree with that. Another one, atheists believe there is no morality. Atheists would disagree. One, there's really almost no atheists that are more agnostic atheists, but still, like that is a strawman of their belief. So these are what a strawman is. So keep in mind of those things when someone's putting words into your mouth and call them out on it. Call them out if they're engaging in a strawman. Next, quote mining. Quote mining is selectively taking phrases out of context to distort an author's original meaning or intent, often used in debates to create a false impression of consensus or expertise. It manipulates quotes to support a specific, often contrary argument that is also known as contextomy or proof. An example of this comes from wasmormon.org, antagonistic website, where they are quoting, and this is an actual quote by Brigham Young. I'm not going to disregard that. This is an actual quote by Brigham Young where he said, "Shall I tell you the law of God in regard to the African race? If the white man who belongs with the seed of Cain, the penalty under the law of God is death on the spot. This will always be so." Now, this is a quote often used by critics that oftentimes when this comes about, we're like, whoa, and sometimes we want to defend it. This was an actual quote that Brigham Young said. However, it needs more context, and especially in its cultural context. Now, just because someone quote mines doesn't mean what they're saying is inaccurate. We would definitely not agree with this statement made by Brigham Young. But again, it's very important that we understand to when someone is quote mining, ask for where the note, the source, the footnote for it, because that's going to enable you to see, is there more here or is it just something I disagree with? So that's very important to also understand. Next, double standard. A double standard is when identical or similar situations or behaviors are judged by different inconsistent standards. They are usually based on bias or prejudice. It is a form of hypocrisy where rules apply to one group but not another. The fallacy violates the principle of consistency in argumentation, creating unfairness. An example of this is God never used physical objects in Revelation. Well, or if you look at this image over here, an evangelical might say, I believe the Bible is God's word. It's true because I have faith in it." And he goes on to say, "Faith is a valid way to know truth. My personal experience matters. The Bible is ancient and has stood for the test of time. It can't be proven wrong, so I choose to follow." And then, for example, they'll talk to a Latter-day Saint and use some atheistic arguments instead of the arguments that they use. So they'll say, "You can't just have faith. That's not a reliable way to know." Well, that's a double standard. Personal experiences can be misleading. You're right. So why are you going on your personal experience? The Book of Mormon isn't ancient or well attested. That's just ignorance, but also again you're making some atheistic arguments there. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Okay, if we're going to use extraordinary claims like the gold plates, for example, the angel that showed the three witnesses and Joseph Smith and Mary Whitmer the plates, then are we willing to say the same thing about the resurrection of Jesus? So you see this double standard, and oftentimes we use it to further our claim, but it's important that we're being consistent, because if we're not being consistent, our argument is a bad argument. So let's keep going. authority. This is a big one. Even I see a lot of missionaries do this, especially at the beginning of their apologetic journeys. So, appeal to authority occurs when a claim is asserted as true, solely because an authority figure supports this. So this is like saying, well, this must be true because this specific person who's an authority believes this. Or for example, it's like saying, well, I'm going to trust what the prophet says because the prophet is a prophet of God. Now, it doesn't mean that I shouldn't trust them, but if I solely do it based just because they're an authority figure, and then that can create some issues. It doesn't have to be a prophet; it can be anyone, it can be a scholar, it can be a historian. If I say, oh, you know, I've read Blake Osler's books, and I'm not going to read anything else than Blake Osler. That is a form of an appeal to authority. That I'm not going to think critically about this because I trust the authority figure. No, experts as authority. There's what I mean, specific.
Daniel, you'll just cut out for like the past 15 seconds. Can you
You
repeat what you
mean
just said?
minority? Okay. Did real quick? Did it? Okay, cool. Next, we have poisoning the well. Poisoning the well is, for example, you have a picture over here with David Snell saying it's a cult. And poisoning the well is using emotionally charged words in order to bias or prime an audience against something before even discussing the actual issues. For a few examples of this, Mormons are a cult. They can't think for themselves. That's also a form of a straw man and ad hominem, or in this, or Christians are cannibals. They eat and drink the blood of a dead man. This was used by pagans in the early church days of early Christianity, um, specifically to support their prejudice and their bias against them. Another one slash antis just wanted to sin, so they read the CS letter for an easy way out. This is again, it is using emotionally charged words in order to prime an audience against something. When you think X members just wanted to sin, you're like, well, I'm not really going to take you seriously. Or if you think a certain group is a part of a cult, which is which is a problematic term to begin with. I recommend doing some research on that on cult models and why they're not accepted, really not accepted very much anymore. But again, and I digress about that. Poisoning the well is a very important thing to be aware of because it separates as good and bad faith actors. Next, argument from ignorance slash silence. So an argument from ignorance slash silence argues it did not happen or isn't true, or because the critic imagine how something could be. It therefore cannot be. Any silence is wrongfully considered to represent an admission of guilt or an admission of ignorance, negative proof. An example of this is someone say, well, there's no archaeological evidence for the Book of Mormon. And because there's no archaeological evidence, that means Mormonism is false. Or some of you may have seen the picture of there's a picture where it says that the world's most depressing job, Book of Mormon archaeologist, and this is discounting all the research that's been done on the topic and just a form of ignorance, but also it's unwilling to engage with the material and understand context. For example, with archaeological evidence, less than 2% of the New World has actually been excavated. So using that argument is not an argument. Now, if someone later on comes down the road and there's evidence to indicate something else, then maybe I need to reevaluate my beliefs or certain commitments that I'm having. But if there's no evidence, just because it's silent it's does not mean that the value claim or the truth claim is incorrect. Argument or the I believe it's the silence of the absence of evidence is yeah, excuse me, the absence of evidence is not that it's not evidence of its absence. So, next, false cause. False cause is assuming that simply because event X occurred before event Y, we may conclude that X caused Y. Causal connections are very difficult to establish. Simple priority in time all by itself is usually insufficient to draw these conclusions. For example, this has been used when the church in 1978 allowed black men to hold the priesthood. People said the church only lifted it because of the BYU boycotts and protests. Now, that may have been a factor, but that's assuming that that was the reason why, and that may really be the case. Shifting the goalpost. Shifting the goalpost argues that because someone cannot explain something, it did not happen, or it isn't true, or because the critic cannot imagine how something could be, it therefore cannot be. Any silence is wrongly considered to represent an admission of guilt or an admission of ignorance. Oftentimes, you may give an argument of why the Book of Mormon is rationally believable, and someone says, "Well, what about the Book of Abraham? What about this and that?" That's shifting the goalpost. That's not the type of what we're talking about, and it also is a form of a it can be a form of a gish gallop by moving the topic. What's very important with here is that if someone's using this on you as a missionary or whoever you're talking to, it's very important that when this happens, you're like, back up a moment. We're supposed to be talking about this topic. I'm fine talking about this topic, but let's stick to the dang topic. Okay. So that's shifting the goalpost. So where do we go from here? This is a list. I know this is a kind of a longer list that other people have done, but it's important to be aware of. So where do we go from here, guys? Well, first, let's check our assumptions. Let's check our own assumptions so we prevent ourselves from going through a crisis of faith. Rather than call out fallacies, help your peers understand them. Help your peers understand why they're important to know and why fallacies actually hurt their arguments. Third, when someone engages in a logical fallacy, share with them the fallacy and why it hurts their arguments. Simply just saying, "Oh, you're engaging in a strawman fallacy," and if they whether they know if it's a fallacy or not, does them no good. Being willing to talk with them of why it's bad, why it's hurts their argument is a lot more helpful, and it allows them to construct better arguments, whether they are a believer or a critic. One of the things that for me is I prefer my critics to be intelligent and engage in as minimal logical fallacies as possible, so they can have their best argument. The fourth, logical fallacy doesn't mean the conclusion is false. A logical fallacy just means that your reasoning is not logical. Doesn't mean your conclusion is false. It means that your reasoning for that conclusion is false. Number five, don't waste your time with those who constantly use logical fallacies, who are bad faith actors. If they're not willing to learn from their logical fallacies, don't waste your time with them. Whether you're a missionary, whether you're a returned missionary, it doesn't matter who you are. Don't waste your time with those that aren't willing to do their best not to engage in them. Not to engage with them. Number six, you will not be completely free of logical fallacies, but recognizing them will help you make better arguments. Pretty sure that's just self-explanatory. Finally, number seven, this is important to prevent yourself from entering a losing battle. It's very important that if you're going to engage in intellectual discourse, to not go into an argument that's a losing battle. You want fruitful discussions. So this is why this matters. I hope this has been helpful. And I'm going to pause right now. I've talked for, I know, a little bit, but I'll pause right now and we can dive into any Q&A if we have any comments or questions. David, do we have any in the comment section any questions there? You're muted or you're quiet. I'll just look. I can't hear you. All right. So we got one question. It says, I don't understand that. Why does science not it says A must therefore be true? Perhaps it is likely, but experts have been wrong before, and they will be wrong again. And they debate and they debate details as even the highest level of scholarship. Yes, that is correct. That is a correct understanding a little bit of there. But citing experts is not, for example, if something has been is accepted in modern academia, even if it is wrong, okay, you are using that to further support your argument. The appeal to authority fallacy comes specifically when you're saying, well, I'm only going to trust this person because they're purely an expert in the field. It should be on the work that the experts do, not the expert themselves, if that makes sense. If you have another question, you're free to, I think it's Raul Brickley. If you want have a follow-up question, you're free to ask. But I hope that's helpful. Um,
You hear me
Yeah,
now?
so just to clarify, oh,
yeah.
sorry. Okay, just to clarify, are you saying that it's okay to cite like sort of would you say like their work, not necessarily them as the source of the evidence, but rather perhaps the evidence that they analyze and their analysis of it? Is that what you mean?
Yeah. So, yeah, great question. And yes, so when you're citing someone, it shouldn't be the person. Their name could be like in a title, but when you're citing someone, you're citing the specific work that they're doing. If I'm going to cite, let's say I want to cite someone on Smith's early life, okay? I'm going to cite maybe, like, for example, I'm going to cite maybe Richard Bushman, okay, or Fawn Brody, who made a specific statement based on historical accounts, but so their work I'm going to cite. However, I'm not going to cite them as being the reason for the information, if that makes sense.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah,
Yep.
I would agree with that too. It's like if you are trying to argue for, like, for example, a late date of the Gospel of Matthew, you don't want to just say, well, a bunch of critical scholars say that Matthew was composed in AD 70. You want to list out the arguments that they have given for the reasoning for that. And then I think it's still respectful to say, hey, it was these scholars who pointed this out. Um, yeah, cite the evidence, not the scholars. It always bugs me when people like, scholars say, well, okay, you're just telling me their conclusion. You're not giving me the evidence for why they concluded that. So,
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
a question from Gage, who asks, is quote mining like proof texting? It doesn't seem quite the same, but I was wondering.
Yes, there's a lot of similarities. You could probably say that proof texting is a form of quote mining, and to a certain extent. Um, so yeah, like I said, quote mining is specifically picking specific quotes and using those to bolster your argument. But oftentimes these quotes are taken out of context. People don't have the context surrounding them or what was said, reason that it was said, the culture that it was said in. So they're very similar, but again, quote mining is being a little bit more specific with a specific quote.
I'll just go for it.
Yeah. You mentioned when you're dealing with a good faith actor, sort of walking through, and if they let's use the straw man fallacy as an example, like you did. They use a straw man fallacy. What is the general idea for going about explaining how that hurts their argument? Like, what is it about a straw man?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, great question. So one of the reasons that a strawman fallacy, or I'll answer it in two parts. The first, answer your first question, how do you go about letting them know? Oftentimes I will just in the conversation, it's like, well, let's hold up from our conversation real quick. That is what you're doing is a strawman fallacy. You're putting words into my specific mouth. Now, second part of your question, how does that hurt the argument? So when I'm talking to someone and they're engaging in a strawman fallacy, I'm saying to them, Well, because of this strawman fallacy, what you're saying is not what the original intent was, and therefore, as a result of that, you're misconstruing the argument itself. And so in other words, you are putting information in that isn't my intent of what we're supposed to be discussing today. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
All,
so in
all-
effect it's like you are arguing against something that isn't actually the argument.
Correct. And oftentimes it is like I said in this presentation, oftentimes a strawman fallacy is used to try to weaken your argument. For example, someone may say that, well, so for example, someone may say that you may say, well, yes, Joseph Smith was married to multiple wives, or Joseph Smith, excuse me, Joseph was married to other men's wives, and as he was just trying to steal their wife isn't for sex. Okay, you can have that position at all, but if you say that's the only position, if you say that's the only position, that's where the issue arises, because why didn't it, and it lacks context. Why did almost basically pretty much none of these wives' husbands have issues with Joseph? In fact, some of them followed their wives followed their wives to Utah, or so there's a lot of things we need to understand when it comes to that. So often it's just weakening the argument, and it's not, and you're trying to bolster your claim, but actually hurt your claim because you're making a false argument that wasn't the intent.
Yeah, so basically, you're just attacking either the weakest form of your opponent's argument or your own argument that your opponent didn't even make. And so that's kind of like disrespectful. It's kind of like arguing with yourself. What you want to do is instead is do a steel man, where really good debaters, the way that they win is because they say, okay, here's my opponent's like the strongest argument I can think of. Here's like, and they got some great points. Yet also, here's the problems with those, and why mine wins out in the end. And so that's how you can do it, is be a very respectful debater, and you will just go super far. So instead of like straw manning like terrible like evangelical arguments for God, you can instead steel man really good evangelical philosopher arguments for the existence of God. And so that will just
And
give you
not
respect points.
and not only that, because I don't want us to think about this purely in debate form, just for genuine conversations with people, truly understanding where they are coming from is very important, because that allows us to have fruitful discussions, especially within interfaith dialogue, not just debates, but just within dialogue, communication, discussions. And let me tell you something, for all you missionaries that after you guys get home, if you want to find your eternal companion, you're gonna have to understand where they're coming from. You can't strawman, or you put words you can't put words in their mouth. You gotta understand where they're coming from. I know it's crazy, right? Awesome.
No matter what logical fallacies your eternal companion uses, they're always right though. So you can discount this whole presentation. So I wanted to add too regarding the good and bad faith acting. A lot of the times, if they use a fallacy and in like an honest dialogue, it doesn't mean they're a bad faith actor. It just means they're the victim of misinformation. And so it's not the fact that they use these fallacies that makes them a bad faith actor. It's if they use them and then you point them out and they still keep using them. But good faith actors will apologize and then agree with you. So yeah.
You cut out for the rest of you guys.
Oh, my bad.
You cut out.
Internet's terrible. What part did I cut out?
You were talking specifically about good and bad faith actors, that they're not necessarily, that sometimes good faith actors do engage in logical fallacies unintentionally. I think is what you're
Yeah.
kind of talking about.
That's right. Yeah. So if you point it out and then they apologize, they're good faith actors. But if they keep sticking with it dogmatically, then they're bad. So,
Hmm.
uh, oh,
Awesome. Any more questions that any of you guys have?
and if there are no more, I have a few exercises of examples of logical fallacy people use, and I want you all to point out which fallacy is being used. But if there are any other questions first. We've got one from Gage. If you have multiple fallacies run together, what do you do with that? That's a good question.
Great question. There's a few things you can do. Typically, a lot of logical fallacies stem from a specific fallacy. So, for example, a gish gallop oftentimes, or excuse me, like for example, appeal to authority or a straw man or ad hominem. Oftentimes, those come from a gish gallop. They may not necessarily be a gish gallop anymore, but they come from for oftentimes like a gish gallop. So when you're confronted with multiple fallacies, I think it's very helpful to take it point by point. If you're having a conversation in person, it's a little bit harder, but writing down their specific argument and you can realize, okay, this is a logical fallacy that they're using that may hurt their argument. So you don't have to be like, oh, you're doing all these logical fallacies, but take it point by point. I promise, if you're going, or I want to hit on this, if you are going to engage in intellectual discourse after your mission, you need to be aware of these things so you can take it point by point. I don't care how much you know, elders, and any sisters that are watching. It does not matter how much you know, okay? If you if you're not able to take things point by point, your conversations aren't going to be fruitful. So when it comes to logical fallacies, understand the fallacy that they're using, take it point by point, and address each fallacy point by point. Does that make sense?
Sarah Ellen always says if I get gish galloped, I guess I just gish gallop them back even bigger, and then they don't respond. So let's go, Sarah. Okay, y'all ready for some examples? Okay, I'm gonna need you to unmute for this too. So just shout it out whenever I read an example, all right? Y'all ready? Okay. First one. Someone comes to you and argues that there were no pre-Columbian horses in Mesoamerica. Then you say that there were, but then they change their argument to saying, well, there's no Nephite horses in America. What fallacy is
Shifting.
that? Good. Shifting the goalposts, right? It's always going to be doing that. Then they're going to discover
Shifting
Nephite
ship
horses,
shifting
and
the
they're going to say,
goalpost mixed with that is good job. Shifting the goalposts mixed with argument from ignorance slash silence. It started from an argument from ignorance slash silence to shifting the goalpost. But good job.
okay, someone says to you, the Book of Abraham has no ancient connections.
Ignorance.
Ignorance. Nice. Right. Well, what would be better is if you disagree with the LDS scholarship that there is ancient connections. That's fine. If you say there are none, you're not addressing those arguments. So nice. Okay. Don't listen what those Mormons have to say. They won't even tell you that Joseph Smith practiced polygamy.
I feel like there's multiple
Poison,
here.
some poisoning the well.
Ignorance
Good.
and
Straw man, probably.
yeah.
Nice. Yep. Yeah. I think that's mostly poisoning the well is right. So good job. Okay. I was a member for over 20 years, and I was a member of the Elders Quorum presidency before I left the church. Therefore, my argument's right.
Appeal to authority.
Nice.
Good job.
It's a pretty bad one at that, right? You're like, what good things do you gain by being an Elders Quorum president? That doesn't teach you very much.
Don't you know I'm more righteous than you?
Don't you know you become a scholar instantly when you become an Elders Quorum president?
That's right. You get like the Mormon DLC that like uploads to your Neuralink, and then you just become a genius. Yeah.
You have more priesthood.
Yeah,
Let's
have
see.
more priesthood.
That's right. Okay. A Christian tells you that they disbelieve the Book of Mormon on the basis of scant witnesses, but then they believe the resurrection based off of witness evidence.
Double standard.
Yes. With the toothbrushing,
Classic one. That
legendary.
classic
Good
one.
job.
Bart Ehrman versus
Blast.
with James White. That's a classic.
Yeah.
Yep. Or Justin Bass. Yeah, that one's a legendary
Oh
one.
yeah, Justin Bass. That's what I meant.
Okay, next one. Brigham Young said, quote, "A man cannot enter the kingdom of heaven without being a polygamist or polygamist." True quote, by the way.
And a
Quote
very
mine.
true quote, and I agree. Just kidding. Don't
Oh,
don't
pause. You just got engaged mode. Chill.
don't tell my fiance
Internet exposure.
that.
Okay, yeah, that's right. It's a quote mine. Daniel, do you want to tell us what the rest of the quote says?
Let's
You remember it?
see. If I can remember, what was the quote again?
Um, basically, well, just you don't have to remember the exact quote, but just remember what he's like, how he qualifies that. It's okay if you
Uh,
don't.
yeah, if I remember, there's because there's a few of those quotes. If I remember correctly, he was referring to specifically the doctrine of pro marriage, and if I remember correctly, he was using that specific argument, or not argument, excuse me. He was using basically just like this is the law, this is an everlasting covenant that God has given us. And in Doctrine 132, it says those that do not accept this will be destroyed. So if I remember correctly, I could be wrong about maybe about this specific quote, but I believe he's talking about that you need to accept, you don't have to agree with the practice of plural marriage, but it is an everlasting covenant. And you need to accept that if you're going to sustain the church, basically, is my understanding of the quote.
Essentially, yeah. He basically goes on to say like you have to be polygamous in your like those who have not been chosen to practice polygamy itself. You have to be a polygamist in your heart, which means you have to accept the practice as valid. So that's what the rest of the quote says. Okay. You Mormons believe God had sex with Mary.
Straw man.
Man, except for
Wasn't that said
maybe a
by
few
like?
authorities. But
Yeah, I was about to say it's like one general authority once or something.
that's right. Yeah, it could be like a generalization, something like that too. So nice. Okay. I discount your argument against the papacy because Eastern Orthodoxy uses that argument, and you're not an Eastern Orthodox.
That's a good one.
Like guilt by association.
Good. Yep, guilt by association. That was a true story, actually, by the way. I mentioned that when Peter, who Catholics believe was the first pope, if he was the pope with universal jurisdiction, how come James is calling the shots in Acts 15 Jerusalem Council? Like, Eastern Orthodox use argument. Like, so? Okay. All right. The Book of Mormon contains 19th century elements.
I don't know what fallacy that is, but I just think yeah and.
All right, anyone else? Any guesses? This was the half-truth fallacy. Is
Okay.
yes. Yes, it does. And you're also omitting valuable information in order to advance your argument that the Book of Mormon is not an ancient document. So, yep, that's true. Okay. Let's see. If I give you a massive list of contradictions between the Book of Mormon and Bible, just prove the Book of Mormon's false. What is that?
You back? Go ahead, David. What were you gonna say? You said if I have a massive list, you need to unmute or connect your audio. Give it a second. Give it a second. Nope. That's okay. Until Dave gets back, I'll use an example. I have a list of problems of why Joseph wasn't a prophet, then what fallacy would that be? If I have a list of accusations, all the reasons why Joseph Smith isn't a prophet, and because he's just a horrible horny punk that was a dirtbag, what fallacy would that be?
Gish Gallop mixed with half truths.
Again, there's one more. There's one more in there.
Oh, ad hominem.
Yeah.
Correct. Good job. Good job, Elder. Are you back, David?
No,
Nope.
he's
Nope,
not
you're
back.
not. Okay. Let's see. Do 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 do. Awesome. Well, okay, awesome. Well, I think with David's connection cutting out, we can probably just end a little bit over an hour. But before we wrap up, before I share some of my final thoughts, what are there any last minute questions any of you guys have? I'll wait 10 seconds. All right, time's up. Okay. Well, so just to kind of conclude my thoughts, I want to kind of end where I began. Elders, and sisters, if there's any sisters watching this one, or Richard missionaries, whoever you are, what's very important is when you are understanding these fallacies, it's very crucial that you understand what these fallacies are, why they're important, and doing your best not to engage in them. You're not going to be perfect. You're still going to engage in them from time to time, and that's okay. It happens. Even experts in discourse still use them, and that doesn't mean your conclusion is wrong, but it does mean that you need to put a little bit more focus on making sure you're using them as little as possible to make your arguments better. And again, if you're a missionary, your time is precious. Don't engage with people that are not going to act in good faith. I would really implore you guys to do that because it's going to allow you to become better intellectually, and it's going to allow you to find people that are ready to hear your message because you don't have time for those people that ultimately don't care. So, those are my last thoughts. Guys, the church is true. Keep learning, keep studying, keep growing intellectually. So, those are my last thoughts.
And if
In the
anyone
name of Jesus
doesn't believe the
Christ.
church is true, they're ignorant.
Facts.
Like Zacharias, the his dumbness has been lifted.
Okay.
Baruch Hashem, bro. All right, guys. Thanks for joining. Daniel, thanks for the awesome presentation. Y'all are the
Yep.
goats. I will upload this to the drive shortly if you want to play it back or whatever. Hear his beautiful voice caressing your ears again or something. But I'll see
Hmm.
y'all guys sometime next month.
David, end the recording, and I have something to say to you real quick.